Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the IFA Digital Think-In series. This is the second of a series of 6 events we're running until the end of November. And of course, we're very grateful to our sponsors, Unifar, whose support is crucial to helping us run the Digital Think-In series. As you know, for many years, Unifar have sponsored our annual conference, which sadly we can't take place this year because of obvious circumstances. But, instead we've decided to put forward the best of what a conference brings, which is thought leadership, provocative thinking, some learning about what's happening in the industry, and some good ideas to take away. So in this event, we're partnering with EY, the global consulting firm, to investigate how innovative contracting might accelerate access to cell and gene therapies. And as you all know, I think cell and gene therapies are among the most exciting developments in the biopharmaceutical industry globally. Both cell and gene therapies aim to treat, prevent, or even cure diseases or rare conditions and so on. And for that reason, because of their power and their transformative effect, they obviously bring great hope to patients, to parents of children and so on. I think many of us have seen this. And with that great hope and that great transformative power comes a massive responsibility, indeed an ethical responsibility, on the industry, on those providers, and also on our payers to do everything we possibly can to bring them to these new therapies to patients. For that reason, I think there's going to be some adaptive thinking required about the kind of reimbursement models that might work for these treatments, which are radically different to what has come before. We know that industry is working hard on this, as EY will show. We know also that the payer, in this case, the Irish Department of Health, Department of Public Expenditure Reform, the HSE, that in Ireland, they will be open to a lot of new thinking because it is required and it is indeed a responsibility. So we're really looking forward to this discussion this morning. First, we're going to hear from Alice Blazat, the innovative contracting lead with EY in the UK, who will set the scene. And then we will have a lively panel discussion featuring Alice, Gilles Ducourroy, the head of real-world evidence services at Novartis, and Dr. Larry Bacon, a consultant hematologist at St. James's Hospital in Dublin, who has real-world experience and indeed dealing in the real world of interaction with patients about these therapies. Gary Comiskey, the Director of Government and Health, EY Ireland, will moderate that discussion. So given that it's a think-in series and we're replicating the best of a conference, some of the best of the conference is of course the discussion and the chat that we have together. So please do use the chat function on this platform and ask questions of our contributors. They're ready to ask whatever questions you'd like. And it really does help to put your hand up or to just type in a question and see how the answer might come back at you, because it does help a lot to have this series be interactive and to ensure that you get your questions answered. As a friend of mine in the media many times told me, that there's no such thing as a stupid question, only a stupid answer. So Alice, it's over to you, and we look forward to this discussion, and I'll come back in at the end. Thank you.
And good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Oliver just mentioned, I will be doing a presentation on innovative contracting. What are the trends that we see in the markets, and more particularly in cell and gene therapies, but also talk about some of those challenges and what potential solution we see in the market. So just to give a little bit of context as per our discussion today. So what do we actually mean by innovative contracting? So many of you probably know about innovative contracting under other terms. So these are usually also called managed entry agreement, value-based contract, outcome-based contract, pay for performance. So a lot of different words that we hear around that topic. But what it means basically is just, when an agreement is reached between a manufacturer and a payer or a provider or even an insurer, depending on the markets, and that allows, for medicines or a device or health technology to reach market based on certain agreed conditions. And those conditions really depends on the specific agreement. So they can be either more financial based, indication based, or outcome based. And usually, payers and a manufacturer will explore those different types of innovative contracting, depending on what benefits they want to have out of it. And the different reasons for that could be to protect price, to basically try and step away from simple discounting that usually destroy value of innovative medicines. And so that's a way to look at price in a different way. It could also be to speed up time to market and shorten lengthy negotiation. It could also be to obtain better access, but also importantly, I think at the moment when we think about outcome-based contracting, to also improve relationship with between manufacturers, payers, and providers, and enhance value proposition, and most importantly, to bring better outcomes for all parties, including patients as well. So here, I think what we've seen in the market, if we think about a financial-based one, these have been quite widely spread in some markets. If you think about price volume agreements, sales and budget cap in countries like Italy, France, Belgium, etc., these have been used quite widely as they are very effective for payers to actually control their spend for a specific treatment or for a specific therapeutic area. And those types of agreements actually don't require a lot of data. So if you think about it, you usually mainly need, sales data or volume data. So very easy for most markets to implement those. Within financial base, we've seen new trends of a more complex one, but it's been already for more than 10 years now. So these are more proxy for outcomes. So again, when you want to bring more certainty about how much is being spent for a particular innovative medicine, but you also want to bring back a little bit of the value proposition from a specific medicine. And that's why we've seen treatment time or dose cap come into the market, where, for example, there may be some uncertainty as to whether the patient will respond at a certain time or after a certain dose. And often payer will want to only pay for those patients that are actually responding. And therefore, those treatment time and dose cap have been implemented to bring that certainty again on value as well. And they've been implemented in some markets, not necessarily widely, as they require a little bit more data than what we've seen in price volume agreement and sales and budget cap. So for these, usually you would need a little bit more, for example, around how much product is used for a specific indication, the time of the treatment as well. So again, here we're increasing the amount of data that is needed. I will talk later about annuity-based and subscription model. These are new trends that we see coming in the market, especially around cell and gene therapy. On the other end of the spectrum, and that will be a lot of our focus for today, is what we call outcome-based contracting. What we mean by outcome-based contracting is where the data that is required to be collected is actual data that comes more outside just the product use, but really a specific outcome, whether that's a clinical outcome, whether that's an economic outcome, or whether that's more of a patient-centric outcome. So usually these are more complex to measure because you will need a lot more data, and that data is not necessarily available. But what we see here, we see two main trends. A lot of markets and payers, again, because a lot of drugs are launching without necessarily real-world evidence at the time of their launch, will provide reimbursement on the condition that more real-world evidence is gathered when the medicine is launched, and that's what we usually call innovative data collections or conditional reimbursement or coverage with evidence development. But usually there's no payment that is linked to it. There might be a decision after that, whether that may impact your reimbursement, access, or price, but there's no real payment linked to it. While, for example, outcome-based contracting is where you actually link a payment to a performance. And within outcome-based contracting, we see different types of contracts. The most common one is what we call outcome guarantee or pay for performance. And that's usually when both parties will contract on a clinical outcome that is usually part of the trial as well. And both parties will agree that the payment will be based on that clinical outcome being reached or not in the real life. However, we see more and more development around more complex outcome-based contracting. And that's where actually both parties may look at other than clinical outcomes to be part of those agreements. So for example, as I mentioned earlier, it could be economic outcomes. We hear a lot in the markets especially from providers and insurers about kind of those downstream benefits from an economic perspective. And those type of outcomes are very relevant for them. And then finally, more patient-centric outcomes. So if you think about quality of life, but also potentially more societal type of benefit like impact for productivity. So these, again, are even more complex type of contracts, but they're way more relevant for all parties to make sure they get the benefit that they need. I will talk later about outcome annuity-based model and milestone-based model when we talk about cell and gene therapies. So now I just want to reflect on some of the trends that we've seen in the European market and in the US market. So basically, what you see in this slide, and here I'm only showing to you the more innovative contracts, so the treatment time or dose cap, the outcome-based contracting, the conditional reimbursement or coverage with evidence, as sales cap and budget cap price volume agreement are quite standard and mainly confidential. But I think what is interesting for our presentation today is really to reflect on what we mean by innovative contracting. And actually, as you can see here, that's not a new topic. This is something that's been talked about for decades now. But actually, as you can see, even though there is an increase in terms of the number of those contracts in market, it still hasn't become the norm globally. And when you look at this graph and you look at Europe, for example, the vast majority of those contracts are usually done in Italy. And that's one of the main markets in Europe where those types of agreement are being done at a national scale. However, we see more and more outcome guarantee and outcome-based contracting, especially at more local or regional level. So, for example, in Germany, we would see some new types of contract based on outcomes with the Krankenkassen, so the insurer. In Sweden, for example, you will have some with a county council, so again, with a regional type of payer. And in other markets, we will see, for example, more pilots with hospitals or with key specialist centers or with a local or more regional payer as well. But we see that most countries, even the big markets in Europe, are still struggling to bring those type of agreements based on outcomes at a national level. A lot of markets have managed to bring those coverage with evidence where there is a conditional outcome for reimbursement. However, they usually are not able to link a payment to it. I think the other important output I want to highlight from this slide is about the therapeutic area. And as you would probably know, and this doesn't come as a surprise, the vast majority of those contracts are being done in oncology. And there are different reasons for that. And I think that's important for the topic today as to, what is driving such contract as we reflect on cell and gene therapies. And this is because of two things. First of all, oncology products have been very innovative in the last few years. They've been very high cost if you think about the cost per year. So what's that actual impact for payers' budget when they look at their annually budget? But also there is a lot of pressure from patients and public opinion to get a lot of the oncology treatment quickly to market. And often there is an opportunity for companies to launch their product with phase 2 trials. And therefore, when it comes to payers, even though they have a strong clinical trial package, they may have some uncertainty about how the drug may perform in real life. And that's why usually there's been a push from payers to have more certainty in real life and to contract on outcomes, but also from the industry, as they want to make sure that by bringing those very innovative products, they also have a chance to negotiate price based on value rather than just on discounting. So very important in that space, and we've seen a lot of noise around outcome-based contracting, more complex type of contracting. So now I would like to focus a little bit more on the trend that we see in cell and gene therapies. And I'm sure a lot of you will be interested in what is happening in the market. So I think here what is very interesting is that as we see the adoption of cell and gene therapies across the globe, as you can see at the top graph, this is the adoption over the years of new outcome-based contracting. And as you can see, there is a sudden explosion in 2019, and we expect even more in 2020 of more complex outcome-based contracting. And, as I said here, similarly to what innovative products have been facing in oncology, we are bringing to market very, very innovative type of medicines, but they have also a very high cost upfront, and they have a high potential in terms of long-term value. However, because payers are looking at, usually an annual type of budget, it's very hard for them to think about how can they afford those medicines. And that's why we've seen more and more of these new contracts coming in the different markets. The vast majority of those contracts are usually what we call outcome guarantees. As I said at the beginning, these are usually based on a clinical outcome that is very much in line with the clinical package. However, we've seen new trends. For example, as I said, coverage with evidence is still an important trend, but as you can see, there's more and more of those contracts where actually a payment is linked. And that's because, again, those treatments are very high cost, and therefore payers need to bring that payment element to it to make sure they can manage their budget. There are other trends that we're seeing. So I want to show you an example here on this slide around annuity-based payment. And here, what has been very complicated for payers is how can they actually bear the cost of those medicines in the first year of treatment, while actually they may have long-term benefit. If you think about the impact those cell and gene therapies will have on healthcare budget, not just medicines budget, this is very threatening and worrying for payers. And that's why in some markets they started to think about how can they actually spread the cost of those medicines over time. And we've seen different ways of doing that in different markets. So here, for example, in Germany, Bluebird Bio has negotiated with different sickness funds, so different health insurance providers at the local level. Again, that's not a national agreement, to pay for the cost of their medicine through different installments over 5 years. And so they will have a first payment upfront, but then the rest of that will be over the years. And if you think about it, for pharmaceutical company, it's a very different ways of impact on revenue. You know, usually those other innovative contracts, as I mentioned, outcome-based contracting, outcome guarantee, treatment time, treatment dose, most of the impact on revenue is usually retroactive. So the medicine will be bought upfront, and then there may be some rebate back from the manufacturer to the payer provider. Well, in this case, there's only a portion of the payment that is made to the manufacturer in the first year, and you'll have to wait for the subsequent year to actually get the revenue from that treatment. So very different approach. Another one that is kind of a slightly different version of that, where there's also kind of a spread of cost over time, but in that case, there's a link to an outcome again. And here, for example, in Spain, Gilead has an agreement for Yescarta with the Spanish authorities. And here, basically, the first payment is done, but the subsequent payment depends on whether the patient will survive or not. So here, again, there's a high uncertainty in terms of impact on revenue and when those payments will be done. And here, again, for payers, it is important to make sure they only pay for patients who actually respond well and get the benefit long-term from those types of therapies. So as you can see here, there's a lot of movement. And what do we expect in the next year? So here I wanted to draw a parallel with what we have seen also in hepatitis C. So if you look at this graph, here you can see, the sales, the global sales for Sovaldi, and you see in 2014 is where, the hepatitis C product have been really, selling very, very well. What that means for payers is that, first of all, there was a curative therapy coming to the market. So if you think about the value proposition of these medicines, this is exactly what usually payers would reward. But one of the challenges they had at the time was that they couldn't really afford to pay for those medicines in the first year for all patients, even though they had such a huge benefit for a healthcare system in the long term. And they really worried about this. So that's why we started to see, new innovative contracts in that space. And in 2014, we saw more than 11 contracts just for Hep C medicine. So there was a huge drive towards that. And what we're starting to see for cell and gene therapy is something similar. So as I said here, in 2019 alone, we've seen a lot of new innovative contracts only for cell and gene therapies. And what we expect is, because once again, in this particular therapy area, even worse than for hepatitis C, the impact on budget for payers is going to be significant. And therefore, they're really worried about how they will manage it. And that's why they will be quite open to look for new ways of contracting. I think here it's going to be very important to make sure that, the conversation with payers will be evolved and will be really about kind of the value delivered. It's going to be also very important for manufacturers, as some payers are still reluctant. But what we believe here is that payer system will have no option but to look at those more innovative contracts, as they cannot just negotiate on simple discounting, as again, the cost of those medicines in the first year are very, very high. Here, as we reflect, as I said, value-based contract will become a trend, even more for cell and gene therapies. But I think what is very important here as to what we hear in the market is that to bring really those type of contract to the market, it's important to also think about what's the value of those medicines beyond clinical outcomes, and how can you bring this as part of your agreement? So if you think about it, the value proposition of cell and gene therapies for many of them is really not just about the clinical value, but it's also about how you can actually, get the patient to go less to the hospital or get less treatment, or how you can improve their quality of life over time, the quality of life of their carer, for example, or how you can have a significant positive impact on society overall. So really important here, and we really expect that there should be a move towards more complex outcome-based contracting with new types of outcome being included as well. So now I want to look at another topic with you. So if we think about, as we discussed, as I said, we call it innovative contracting just because, in some market, the topic is not innovative, as in we've talked about it for years. In some market, they may be more advanced than in others, but as I said, in the vast majority of market, it's still early days. And why is that? And it's actually because there's a lot of historical challenges, and most of them remain. And it is becoming a real barrier for those types of agreement to scale. So if I look at the challenges here, there are two main types of challenges, and I will start with the value and financial challenges. So if we think about the pharmaceutical companies' concerns in general, first one is that because of the complexity of those agreements, and if you think about those new ones in cell and gene therapies, it's very hard for them to understand what could be the quick commercial return. It is very hard to predict how those agreements may play out and may impact revenues. The second element and challenge, more on the pharma side, is how do they actually align with outcomes that they can influence? So as I said, payers and providers are pushing towards more outcomes beyond just clinical outcomes, but these outcomes may not necessarily be directly linked to the medicine efficacy. So how do you make sure that you can still align on those outcomes and have an impact on those outcomes to de-risk the performance on that? If you think more on the payer and provider side, one of the key challenges here is about how do they actually manage their budget for multi-year budget. And I think here, especially for cell and gene therapy, is very relevant. Payer system in the vast majority of market, they really think about their budget on an annual basis. They look at their medicine budget for 1 year and then they reflect for the next year. So it's very difficult for them to really think about long-term value and how they can see the benefits further on. So, if you think about those annuity-based and milestone-based type of agreement, where there is installments and spread of cost over time, this is important to think about those challenges. Number 4, I want to talk about here, it's really important, as what we hear a lot from payers and providers is that they're quite uncomfortable with the risk they're taking. And that's quite similar to what I said from the pharma side around the difficulty to see the quick commercial return. And here, on the payer side, it's similar because, those types of agreements are impacted by real world data. They may not understand what could be the impact. So for them, when they do a price volume agreement or a sales cap, it's very easy to understand what will be the actual impact of their budget, or at least the maximum impact. While for those type of agreements, they don't really know what potentially will be the impact on their budget. Number 5, I think that we hear, not all cases, but that's a challenge that sometimes comes to people's mind, is that so often they see that those type of agreements that are brought to the table are too pharma-centric. And again, it goes back to number 2, where we talked about aligning on outcomes. If you think about, what a provider, a physician, a patient may want, they may want to have a drug that is effective and safe. But actually, what we hear from a physician often is that if they are to prescribe a drug, it means that they believe in the efficacy of this drug. And therefore, they are quite interested in other types of outcomes, such as economic outcome for their hospital, where they could free up beds more quickly. Or, for example, to make sure that their patient have a better experience or have a better quality of life. So once again, they're very interested in those other outcomes. But as you've seen, in the vast majority of outcome-based contracting, most of the time, the outcome is usually a clinical outcome. And then there are another type of challenges, which is around data. And this is absolutely critical when we think about what solution can we bring to market. The first one here is about data availability and quality. This is critical. The move towards outcome-based contracting is not an easy one, because often, you may agree that you may need to look at a specific outcome, but actually the data is not there, or the data is there. But if you think about a national scaling, maybe that data is not of good quality everywhere, or is not captured in all either practices or hospitals. So it can be difficult actually to think about the data to support such a complex, innovative contract. And also here, this is critical because you need both parties to really trust that data as well. Data privacy concern is a big topic, especially I think everyone that hears about GDPR in any conversation will usually be very, very worried. And that's why data privacy concern is very important to make sure that, everything is compliant in terms of how the data is accessed, what is the data used for, and make sure that, if that's part of an agreement, actually, you're only looking at a specific type of data to inform a specific contract. And then finally, I think you'll all be familiar with this one as well. This is seen as too much effort. When we talk to payers, often they say, well, are you willing to expand those type of contracts in our market? And they say, well, actually, not necessarily, because at the moment, most of the burden is on us. It's on pharmacists and physicians often to, input into Excel type of documents, manually a type of data or type of information. And then you have other resources who needs to look at these, do the analytics, and take care of the claims and credit notes. So often those schemes are still very much managed in a non-digital way through Excel spreadsheet. And therefore, a lot of markets are quite worried about scaling because they're not entirely sure that they'll be able to manage those type of agreements. So now what I would like to do based on those challenges, we've been doing a lot of work within our team at EY. And really, the work we've been doing the last year has been around innovative contracting strategy. But we were quite frustrated with those challenges that I've just presented to you. And so we developed our own EY Health Outcomes platform to really overcome those historical challenges.
As pressure rises on healthcare systems, there is a more urgent need than ever to link payment to real-world evidence to allow better care, better outcomes, and better access to treatment for patients. But there are many barriers. Collecting and sharing data securely is challenging. Trust between stakeholders is hard to establish, and the bespoke nature of these contracts makes them difficult to deploy at scale. The EY Health Outcomes platform is an industry-wide utility to support value-based contracting. The platform allows users to create contracts in a standardized yet flexible way and automates full end-to-end contract management, eliminating burden on all parties. The platform facilitates the triple win. It helps patients to access the new treatments they need, allows payers and providers to offer better care, and provides life sciences companies with the chance to prove the value of their products. Life sciences companies and healthcare players create digital contracts, which include the requirements for measuring their success. By leveraging blockchain, data is accessed at its source while respecting data privacy and ensuring data protection. These sources are connected to a transactional data layer, which manages the data, and the contracting parties can then analyze the outcomes via the user interface. Find out more about how the EY Health Outcomes platform can foster collaboration across payers, providers, and life sciences companies to scale the use of value-based contracts and provide better outcomes to patients.
All right, so to finish this presentation, I would like to reflect on, we've talked a lot about challenges, but some of the encouraging trends that we're seeing as well. So as I said here, when we think about outcome-based contracting, and we talked about those new outcomes that are quite important to start capturing. And, it's because what we've seen in the market is actually that, alongside the data explosion and the need to collaborate, there's more and more empowerment for patient and consumers. So as you can see here, there's been a real shift of power that we expect even further in the future, with payers getting more and more power, but also most importantly, patient and consumer. If you think about yourselves as a consumer outside of, healthcare, I think you'll be you probably have noticed how much of a gap there is between your healthcare experience as a patient versus your experience as a consumer for other industries. And there's a real gap here in terms of the experience and benefit that needs to come to patients. So I think here, as we reflect on outcomes, again, very important to think about how those patients are getting more and more power and how they're an important target also as part of those agreements moving forward. And so to close my presentation, I thought I would share a little bit of insight that we got from some of the analysis we've done during the COVID pandemic. And so obviously it's been a very, very stressful time. But I think there's some very interesting move in the healthcare industry. If you think again about that challenge around data that we've seen, that we discussed about how actually can you get more data that are relevant on patient outcomes or economic outcomes. They're not necessarily already available in markets. But also we talked about data privacy concern and making sure all parties are comfortable with sharing the data. What is very interesting in the COVID pandemic is that we've seen all across industries a real increase in the use of digital services. But if you look here in healthcare, there's been a jump of 38% of consumers actually starting to use those digital services more than before. So I think this is a very encouraging fact that we're seeing here and trend that we believe will continue after this pandemic. And I think that will bring more and more a move towards outcome-based contracting and bringing more patient-relevant outcomes to those agreements as well. So thank you very much all for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Now I'm gonna hand over to Gary, and Gary will walk you through the panel. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining our virtual conference this morning. Thanks, Alice, for that really interesting presentation. And thanks, Oliver, for the opportunity to moderate this session here on behalf of EY this morning. We've set aside around about an hour to go through the panel discussion and then take some questions from the audience. So there is an opportunity, I think, in the screen, in the chat session or section on the screen for you to input some questions, and we look forward to receiving those throughout the course of the panel discussion this morning. As Oliver said at the start, one of the key benefits of a conference or a session like this is to be able to have an interactive discussion and take some questions. With that in mind, I'm delighted to join in our panel this morning. We have some really great speakers who can share really different perspectives and really interesting perspectives on what we are talking about today. So firstly, Dr. Larry Bacon is a consultant hematologist at the National Allogenic Bone Marrow Transplant Centre at St. James's. He's also the clinical lead of the National CAR-T programme. And in addition to his medical degree from the RCSI, Larry also has a Bachelor of Science and a PhD in biochemistry from NUI Galway, and was a postdoctoral research fellow at UCD. So we'll hear from Larry in a moment. Gilles Ducroix is the head of real-world evidence services at Novartis. And in addition to Gilles' role at Novartis, he also contributes to the MSc in Health Economics in NUI Galway and to the MSc in Health Service Management at DCD. And Alice Blizato, you've heard from, is a senior manager with EY's Health and Life Sciences team. And Alice is a specialist in our pricing and market access team, and she also leads our innovative contracting services and is working quite a lot on that health outcomes platform that Alice demonstrated the video from a little bit earlier. So maybe I think now that we've done those brief introductions, it might be worth going around the panel. Larry, I might start with you, maybe just to give us a minute or two as to why you think these topics or this topic is important, and what you think the key areas from a doctor's point of view, I suppose, that we should think about.
Okay, thanks, Alice, for that presentation. It was very informative and even made sense to a doctor, so that was good work, Gary. So from my perspective and from the medical perspective, the CAR-T, I'm going to speak predominantly to CAR T therapy, because that's where I've been involved. Is a very exciting innovation for us. It comes with very complex pathway, though, as I think Alice may have shown. It's not just about a drug anymore. It's about a drug and a support service that links in with it. So it's no longer just let's buy the drug and go with it. There are huge extra costs that'll come along with that, which includes inpatient bed stays, increased services. It's not going to take away any of our current services. It's going to actually add. It's going to hopefully take a group of patients, a group of about 40% of people with lymphomas whom otherwise had no options and were likely to come in palliative care, to giving those a curative option. So from our perspective, it's important that we find a way to fund these, because they are extremely expensive. And as I said, not just the drug, but to the hospital costs as well.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. And I think there are topics that we'll get to pick up as we go through the sessions. Gilles, I suppose from your point of view, just again, what are you seeing from the life sciences point of view, and what are the key important developments, I suppose, that you're experiencing at the moment?
So maybe I will start with my own experience, because it's a very important topic for many reasons. One is because of that was mentioned in the slides, the Novartis portfolio, and we have 3 cell and gene therapy. The other one is something that we've created in Ireland, is a think tank between our manufacturing sites, where I work in the global services, also the country affiliate in pharma in Onco, and also the new division of Novartis in terms of the gene, where we created a think tank between, as Larry said, not just the people working on the drug, but also the manufacturing side. How can we really work together, put a brain together to really help in terms of the access? And the last one is on a personal level. It's pretty amazing to be part of that journey, where you really can transform the life of patients. But the reality is, and I'm taking all that when I was in IFA in terms of the market access forum, most of the healthcare system are not ready for the cell and gene. And in a way, it probably would be perfect, because it's a very small number of patients, so they should be probably quite easy. But the reality is, it's much more complex. So it's an amazing journey.
Thank you very much, Gilles. Yeah, I think some really interesting topics there. Alice, I think again you probably touched on a lot of the key areas that you're seeing in your work, I suppose, for organizations around the world. I suppose, are there 2 or 3 things that you think we should really bear in mind for our discussion this morning?
Yeah, I think I've covered some of it, but as Gilles said, a lot of payer systems are not actually ready. But I think, it is the time, and there is an urgency to actually move towards more innovative contracting for those particular medicine. I don't think there's a choice for payers to continue to, discount on those medicines. So I think this morning it's important to keep in mind, the challenges we've seen in the past, but also to think about solutions to really enable also those payer systems to be able to implement those type of agreements. And again, I think the other thing, I think I've said in many times in my presentation, but really rethinking what we mean by outcomes and how we make sure, that outcomes are relevant for all parties, but also for all customers.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks everyone. There's loads of questions coming in, which hopefully we'll get a chance to get to most of them. So really appreciate that. Larry, maybe going back to yourself for a moment. I suppose one of the things that you probably experience as a doctor working with patients is, a desire or an opportunity to prescribe or to form new and innovative forms of treatment. What sort of challenges, or do you see challenges in terms of how you can make those become a reality for patients, maybe with the existing health services, in terms of resources that are available, maybe paying mechanisms and so on? And what do you think we need to be doing here in Ireland to make sure we don't fall behind, I suppose, what you might see in other health systems?
Okay, well, I'll start, Gary, by just saying that we still haven't set up our CAR T program. We still haven't been funded for our CAR T program, although we're almost there with the setup. And I think, in fairness to the people involved in that, the companies, the NCCP and the HSE, there's a willingness to try and get there. But as I said, the cost is expensive, and the cost of the drug is one thing, and you've probably seen that the studies out there that show that there's, in the US, it costs approximately 82,000 euros per patient per admission on top of the cost of the drug, which is, already it's all out there quoted at a final cost of over 300,000. The people are trying very hard to get this through, and we're working through with that. It's a very complex process. So typically a drug is expensive, but you just prescribe the drug and things move on. For now, this is a technology. I know it's classified as a drug and it's got EMA approval as a drug, but in truth, it's a technology. It's a stem cell based therapy, and that comes through when you go to try to set this up. So at the moment, as we're setting it up, we have 15 steps to try and get a drug to the patient instead of writing a prescription. So very, very different. And that steps involves getting the right referral pathway, getting the right patient at the right time for the treatment. We now have to register for the drug on a portal system and sit and wait and see when the next slot is available before we can even start the process for the patient. Initially, there were delays even in that, but apparently, because of increasing manufacturing sites, this is not so much of a problem. We have to get the patient in for an apheresis, which is taking their own stem cells off before we can modify them. This involves involvement from our cryobiology lab. Again, a group which heretofore haven't been involved in anything to do with a drug per se. Then patients have to have more chemotherapy while they wait for this drug to be manufactured. And I see a question coming through there from Graham asking, why aren't we doing this in Ireland to save a day? And that's a very good point and a very good question. So for now, that drug is to be collected from our lab, sent to somewhere in Europe where it gets processed, then sent to the UK to the US for manufacturing, and sent back to a central facility again for quality, and then sent back to Dublin, which takes, in general, about 28 to 35 days. I think some companies will say you can get it a little bit quicker than that, but that's an extra month in a group of patients who have a relapsing disease. And on the clinical trials, about a third of those people never got the drug because they died between the time of the apheresis and the trial. So that's a very valid question that Graham asking, and I think the companies are asking, and indeed I know from Nibert, if the companies are asking the same questions, why can't we do it here? So that's something that we again will have to keep looking at. Then the patient has to be admitted to hospital. It's typically at least a 15-day admission. Again, a new complexity that maybe companies didn't realize, and I'm sure we didn't realize, that once you make it a drug and the EMA are involved, there's new requirements. So you have to train ICU, you have to train urology. So they have to come to meetings and then they realize, hey, you're bringing in new products. We need more resources if you're going to do this. And then there's a cry out, and everybody's under pressure. So a realistic cry out for more resources for that. Then when the product comes back, it comes back to our laboratory, but now it's left as a stem cell, and it's come back, or a T cell, it's come back as a drug. So now a new step for the pharmacist, they have to come to the cryobiology lab, verify all of the documents that have come back, you make sure that it meets their criteria. Then somebody from the lab has to bring it to the ward because it comes back frozen, so they're used to thawing the products there. And then we're now at the question of, does the laboratory technician, the pharmacist, the two nurses, and the doctor have to be there for the infusion to be sure that everything is documented correctly? And then we've the side effects that are well documented and out there after a CAR-T infusion. Thankfully, in the earlier trials, there was a number of unexplained deaths from cerebral toxicities and some from cytokine release syndromes, which we seem to have overcome now, and they're much less, thankfully, but there still is two main side effects: a cytokine release syndrome, and then later on, a couple of days later, maybe a neurobiology syndrome. And that's why ICU have to be made aware of these patients, and urology, because their interactions needed. And for us, what all of other centers are doing is informing ICU and urology on the day of admission of a patient. I mean, that's unheard of for us as we give our standard drugs and do our standard transplants at the moment. So that's another thing that's going on. And then hopefully patient will get discharged 2 to 3 weeks later. But then there's a follow-up requirement for the patient to stay within the environment of the hospital for 28 days. And the rule is something like 5 kilometers or something like that. And that's because of the potential side effects that can come, that if they've come from Kerry and they're down in Kerry with a side effect, they're better off back at the center, which is used to dealing with those side effects. So that's an extra month cost for the patient, to have to stay in Dublin if they have come, and we all know how expensive it is to rent here. And then there's the possibility of hypogammaglobulinemia post this, and do we need to give IVIG infusions monthly? There again, up to 5,000 euros a month to replace them, and that potentially lifelong. And a secondary, a later effect of a thing called HLH, or it's called Hemophagocytic Lymphohistocytosis, which again requires very complex treatment. And then there's follow-up with PET CT scans, and you know, at a month, 3 months, and 6 months at least is the standard for now. And you have to remember, this is in a group of patients whom otherwise, to be crass about it, would have died and would have been no cost. It's fantastic that we have this, and it's super to have it. But these are all of the costs that come into providing this new service. So although the pharma requirement of being reimbursed is important for pharmacy from the HSE's perspective and from the hospital perspective, you can see how much effort or how much resources and requirements are needed to go in behind that. And I think when we started discussing this first with Novartis and with Gilead, who are sort of leading the field at the moment, we kept emphasizing that this is not just the drug price. You know, there needs to be, you know, more thought about for the total cost of this. So I probably rambled too much and maybe not answered your question, but that's my insight into CAR-T for where it sits now.
No, thank you very much, Larry. I think that was really interesting. And I think, you know, you probably highlighted the fact that it's much more than just the financial cost, as you say, and there's so many other steps involved, and even the interaction with other, you know, clinicians in terms of having people trained up and aware of what the problem is or what the problems could be is such an important piece. And I suppose, Gilles, maybe jumping across to yourself, because in your world, I suppose, you know, looking after real world data and, you know, the importance of that. And I think, as Larry described the process there, and I think he mentioned that 15 steps that might have to be gone through. No doubt you experience lots of challenges in terms of getting the data that you need. So from joined up medical records, you know, being able to get access to data at all different points. Is that something, you know, I suppose that you see, you know, what sort of strategies have you got in place then in order to be able to try and access that necessary data to show the effectiveness of some of these treatments?
So it's interesting because the level of difficulty is quite high, but the level of opportunity is also really high, even more when I'm listening to Larry and some of the kind of the usage in kind of the real life. In terms of the challenges, one I'm not going to mention. Alice mentioned it, is data privacy. I'm not going to go there. The second one she mentioned is access to data. And that's something really interesting for me, because I have in my team some really bright data scientists, really good. But no data, you can have the best data scientists in the world. If you have no data, you have no data. There's nothing they can do. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the quality of the data. We're getting a lot of the project where there's, you have to see my team is working on secondary data. So what we work on is insurance claim, electronic medical record, or registries. But that wasn't designed as a clinical trial, and it was designed for other purposes. So there's a lot of missing data. There's a lot of, and that's one of the issues. The other issue is, and it's linked to what Larry was saying, is the real-time data. Most of the data that I have access to are 3, 6, or 9 months old. But in oncology, 9 months is a lifetime. So it's kind of the other one is, I know there was a question on is about trust, and if you look at randomized clinical trial, there's very strong guidelines, and it's been if you look at where I used to work previously, economic modeling, you have very strong guidelines. In real world evidence is just coming now, and there's a lack of guidelines, and it's happening. Most of the at the time you have the FDA and the EMA coming with different guidelines. If some people are interested, there's an article yesterday in Value in Health about the transparency, that everybody needs to be transparent. And the last thing is really also, and I was mentioned in the talk, is the need in Germany from the payers, or the needs in Spain or Nordics are very different. So that makes it a little bit complicated. But I'll finish on the positive in terms of what's happening. I think there's this big push at the European level in terms of the data harmonization. I know there's the IMI project, and that's really good on that front. Also, the country we work in there's a big collaboration between government, academia, hospital, and pharmaceutical to work together to create kind of the data. From what I've seen the power of very strong registries. I'll just give you an example. We worked recently on the bad beer, so it's kind of in terms of the UK, so the British Association of Dermatology, and they have most of the biologics that are being used are on their registry, and you can access to the data. The power of having access to that registry data, and it's fantastic. And there's so much research that can be done, that will help in terms of market authorization, in terms of payer, better understanding of the disease. And something that I'm quite hopeful is, I've seen what's happening with the COVID in Ireland. And every day you have, at, I don't know, 6 o'clock, you have the news about the number of patients, real life data, the power of data. If some efforts were going to be made at the same level for drugs reimbursement or for cell and gene, it can be done. If you had to ask a year ago, I think people would say it wouldn't be done for COVID. It's been done. So I think I'm quite positive on that front.
Oh, it's good. It's an interesting link you make there. I think, Gilles, to the information that's been shared all the time when it comes to COVID, and maybe, yeah, as you say, getting access to that for other areas would be really, really interesting. Alice, I might jump across to one of the questions that have come in, and it links in neatly with the presentation that you had done as well. So you talked about sort of the innovative contracting models, and maybe in Ireland we've been more traditional in terms of the way we've contracted. Sarah has asked, given that we've seen a big uptake in Netflix subscriptions during lockdown, is there a Netflix payment type model that might be used as a practical solution? And maybe linked with that, in reality, would it be necessary to have to have at least two or maybe multiple models? So, the more traditional model for the traditional therapies and drugs, and then maybe something more innovative for things that are still coming available. Don't know if that's something you've seen, Alice, or something that you think might be an option for Ireland.
I mean, first off, on the Netflix model, so we do see, but mainly in the US market, what is called a subscription model, and that's basically for a fixed fee, unlimited use of product. We've seen it a lot in hepatitis C because of the number of medicines that were launched in a short space of time, and the difficulty for a payer often to really understand the difference in terms of value around those medicines, and that's why in the US they've been using that model. I think for cell and gene therapies, because of that long-term value that is being brought, I don't really think this is something that is necessarily explored, and I would say mainly for the European market. I think European payers, in the vast majority of market, are really more looking into value, so they would want to have an outcome linked to this. I think in terms of subscription, that might just be more about the installment and thinking about how you split those costs over time rather than having that whole payment up front. So I would say, yes, we've seen that in European markets, not so much, mainly in the US. For cell and gene, I think as long as it will be linked to kind of value or an outcome element, that might be an opportunity. Then in terms of your second question, Gary, around whether innovative contracting is for all medicine, certainly not. I think anything that is based on outcomes or is more complex is only something that payer will think about for more innovative and high cost drugs. I mean, you've seen that it's not necessarily the norm yet, so they will focus really on those medicines where they have tougher negotiation around, a lot of back and forth between their proposal and the reaction from the manufacturer about making sure they are not destroying the value of their product. So I think those, price volume agreement, sales cap, budget cap, or even also used generally for high cost drugs in the market where they're using them widely. And that's because, those have a potential to have a high budget impact. So I think for more established products, where there's not necessarily a high cost or a high value, I think, simple discounting or no discounting might be the way forward. I think to reflect on outcome-based contracting against cell and gene therapies and where the opportunity is, I think Gilles, I quite like that you picked up on the word trust. I think a lot of it is based on trust. It's also based, obviously, on digital solution, but trust is very key. I think some markets have already experience of innovative contracting, and they haven't necessarily been successful. They usually, as I said, they carry most of the burden. They really struggle, to get any real output from those contracts and really see kind of what was the benefits for both parties actually. And so a lot of markets have, stepped away from it because they were not really certain and they were not trusting each other. So that trust element is key. And I think also, if you think about outcome, I think, Larry, you mentioned about those, one thing is about the cost of the drug, but it's also about all those are impact downstream, whether they're positive or negative. Negative by this, I mean, downstream cost for the healthcare system. So I think here, making sure that, both parties are working together and they are co-creating those engagements and agreements is very, very critical. In terms of the work we've done, I would say that where we had the best outcome has been when, the pharma company was working hand in hand with the provider and the payer to really look together at what are the outcomes that are relevant for both parties. I think it has helped, enhance their relationship, enhance the trust, and really, make them to work in a better way together. I think what is interesting in cell and gene therapy, something I didn't cover earlier, but I think, Gilles, you mentioned about first the data. Actually, yes, there is a lot going on in terms of standardizing the data sets. The EBMT for bone marrow transplant, for example, is doing a lot of work around, putting together specific data sets for some of the CAR T therapies. It's not yet for all cell and gene therapies, but the work they've done is very interesting, because what it means is that most European market will then, follow those data sets. So, for example, if you think about oncology, a lot of people think that, for example, in England, we have very good data sets. There is a good data set in oncology, but actually it doesn't capture any relevant outcomes. So it doesn't capture, apart from survival, it doesn't really capture any of those outcomes that are relevant for parties. And in another market, it will be captured in a very different way. So, as Gilles was saying, different payer systems have very different ways of negotiating and different benefits for them as well. But I think the fact that for cell and gene therapies, it's launched in an environment where we've been facing those challenges. There's a lot of work that is being done around, making sure that data is a bit more standardized for those therapies across Europe. So that should help. And I think the second point is that, a lot of those patients are usually very concentrated in a specific market. So one of the challenges sometimes to scale up those innovative agreements might be because in more traditional oncology, patients are usually spread across the country. And so you may have those key centers where you have very good data, but if you want to do something nationally, it may be hard actually for other centers to have such good quality of data or even any data at all. So I think cell and gene therapies has even a bigger opportunity because often those patients are concentrating on very specialist centers, and they're usually members of those bigger organizations at the European level, and they do a lot around outcomes as well. So I think there, even though there's a big challenge ahead of us, is actually, I think, a true opportunity in terms of those enablers.
Yeah, no, thanks. Larry, maybe just to go back to you for a second and pick up on a question that's come in there from Frank and talking about sort of, one of the real appeals, I suppose, of gene-based therapies is the nimbleness and responsiveness and the speed of development. Although given the steps you outlined, I suppose it's, it's still a challenge, but I suppose a lot faster than you would have in traditional sort of development. I suppose Frank is wondering, could COVID now be sort of a game changer when it comes to gene therapy adoption? I know it's not directly in your own area of specialism, but do you see links there, maybe that this has now given us a chance to move into something and kind of maybe mainstream a little bit things that we're seeing as quite innovative up to now?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I think COVID has put a lot of pressure on the health system, as you know. It's put a huge pressure on beds and keeping beds available. It's put a huge pressure on cost within the system, and I think I would have been thinking more the opposite, that the amount of costs and and money spent on COVID may actually slow up bringing in innovative therapies. Costly innovative therapies. Now, as I said, I know people are working hard, within their, if I can use that word, which I hate, silos. Working within their own areas, continuing to develop. But I'm not sure that COVID is an advantage in the current setting. We from our own perspective, from our own transplant program in St. James's, we during that first wave, we did have to cancel or postpone transplants that were considered non-emergency. So these were people whom they could have that transplant later after consolidation. And for those who needed their emergency transplants, we proceeded through them successfully without any COVID cases, thankfully, and more importantly, no COVID-related deaths. So for something like the CAR T coming in, needing extra beds and not having them available, and then that fear of the immunosuppression and the risk of COVID, it may actually slow things up rather than help. If that's where you were going with that, or?
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting perspective. I think, yeah, sometimes, it's as you say, it's good to take that step back and realize that it's it's one thing maybe developing a therapy or whatever it might be, but as you say, the other resources that are needed within the health system are very, very difficult to come by, particularly here in Ireland, where we're probably underbedded, I suppose, by European standards to start with. Yeah, so it's
and cancer, although critical, often gets the I suppose the sort of the shame of being over subscribed. If you talk to my colleagues in stroke medicine and cardiovascular medicine, they would feel that there is already an unequal share of budget towards cancer and cancer therapies. Not in any bad way, and that would take it up, but just sort of saying it's a heavy burden already, and people whom for the cost of one CAR T therapy, it's likely you could probably do, I don't know, 150 hip operations, give people an excellent quality of life, and meanwhile it's often put to us that you want this CAR T therapy for this cost, or you want this new therapy to prolong somebody's life for 8 or 9 months. So that's often something that pops up in this debate as well, as we fight for resources within a resource tight environment.
Yeah, no, and I think that's interesting, Gilles, maybe to pop back to yourself for a moment and pick up on that point, I suppose, a little bit in terms of how we capture the data. And you talked earlier about, some of the challenges and some of the things that need to be addressed. I suppose from your experience and picking up on Larry's point, have you seen, where once we get access to the right data, it can be really powerful, or have you seen examples of where it works really well?
Just maybe before I answer your question, maybe on Larry's comment, and I fully agree, we see it across the world. The pressure on the healthcare system, also the pressure on the finances. So that's kind of what is changing for me in my world in the real world evidence, where previously we were really maybe 1 year before launch where people were looking at the real world evidence. Now, I would assume most of the pharma company, now it's at phase 2, where you look at your real world evidence plan, because for exactly what Larry is saying is the level of evidence you will need to bring for the health authorities and the payers, it's going to be much higher, because as Larry said, it's opportunity cost. So you will have to make some. So I think the level of evidence you will have to bring. So some of it will be from the randomized clinical trial, absolutely, and some of it will have to be with kind of with the real world evidence. And that makes the link with your question also. It's a real pleasure for me to work, for example, with the Nordics, where you have access to primary care hospital data. Now we have access to FinGen, so genetics data. Working with the UK, with the CPRD, and now the UK Biobank, working with the US, where you have access now to 80 million patients through Optum and others. So we can do a lot, but real world evidence is not the answer to everything. Just to be clear, it's really good if you want to have burden of disease, if you want safety, because that's one of the treatment pattern. So that's kind of but there's also kind of the limitation. But what we've seen is if it's applied correctly, really you can help in terms of market authorization. Now you can have, for very rare disease or for a line extension, just market authorization based on real world evidence data. So that's kind of that's happening mainly at the FDA level, not at the EMEA, a little bit less to be fair. And also, as Alice mentioned, some conditional reimbursement that are also in place. Of course, I'm biased. I'm a big fan of real world evidence, but it's a kind of a growing area for all the pharma companies, and it's linked to the evidence that you will need to bring for market authorization and also for reimbursement. There is so much we can learn. And for me, maybe cell and gene, it's very low number of patients at the moment, and it's a once-off therapy. And now, previously I used to work in chronic disease, and the big issue you had in asthma and COPD is adherence. This one is for once we don't have the issue. The issue is it's a once-off. But as Larry said, it's much more than a drug. So there's also something to take in consideration. So hopefully I answer your question, Guy.
No, for sure, Gilles. That was very interesting. I think that point you make is that it's a once off, and if you get it right, then you don't have the adherence to drugs that you have, as you say, with those chronic diseases, and that's really important. And I suppose sometimes, given that it is that sort of once off, and it's and I don't know, Larry, if you experience this, do people almost have a perception that it's sort of like a miracle cure? And I don't know, when you're dealing with patients and you're trying to decide, in terms of access to clinical trials and so on, is there an expectation gap there where people are sort of coming to you, that you have to try and I'm sure it's part of your day job to try and manage that and try and make sure, as you said at the outset, that it's really that, that you're picking the right people in terms of being able to give an access to that. I'm sure that must be something that's a real challenge from time to time.
Yes, it is for sure. And as I haven't mentioned today, but you're probably aware that at the moment people are receiving CAR T therapy in a way in Ireland, in that the HSE, through the treatment abroad scheme, for the first time ever in a term that, as I said, called a drug, are funding people to go to the UK for licensed therapies. And to date, we've sent 6-7 people over, I think, already at a huge cost, I'm sure. I'm not privy to how much the London hospitals are charging. For the term. So those people are now back in our waiting rooms and I'm sure Gilles will be happy to hear most of them have done very well. So they're talking to the guy beside them in the chair to say that they've just been in London for a CAR T therapy for my lymphoma. So obviously the next question from that patient when they come into the clinic is, when am I getting my CAR T therapy? That guy looks great outside. So again, I mean, in fairness to patients that were taken along this lymphoma journey, they have, for them to get the CAR T, they've already relapsed, had salvage therapies, and are moving along. So they quite understand the processes that are involved and why or why not they're the right person to go for CAR T. And I think the fact that we have access to at least be able to send them there if they are the right fit for that makes our apply a little bit easier. But it is interesting. While we'll all say, "Oh gosh, no problem, we'll just hop over to London." The first person we sent was a guy in his 50s. I'm from the Midlands, so I can say from the Midlands, whom had no passport, never left the country before. And like the turmoil of having to go to the UK for a treatment, there was more nearly fuss for him about trying to get a passport to get there than anything else. So for a lot of us, these sort of things sound like, oh, that's all right, that's easy. But that was a huge deal for them to have to pack up and go. So that was an interesting point I learned, at that level, that although he was getting a very high dose therapy, a very, highly specialized therapy, his life to that point had been very straightforward. He's back. He went over in COVID time, so we were lucky. He just got there the week the COVID broke, so he was lucky. He got there. He's home. He's 6 months, and he's in remission now. So he's done fantastically well. From, as I said, he's 52. He would have been a guy who would have been sent home for essentially palliative care 4 months ago. So the opportunities for this are huge. Managing expectations is also big. So we have, as you know, we have 2 licensed therapies, and I think Gilles was beginning to talk about this and the low number of patients at the moment. It's a low number, but we already know that there's new indications for those therapies that are there, maybe coming behind, which is going to raise the numbers of patients. But there's also new therapies coming. So I think the next big one that was going to hit us is for the therapy for multiple myeloma, very common disease. Very, I would have to say, nasty disease. Life expectancy, at max 8 to 10 years at the moment if you're diagnosed with it today. And some will do much better than that, obviously. Some will do worse, but you would sort of be quoting those numbers. So CAR T therapy is almost there for them. But at the moment, and I'll say this, at the moment, the CAR T therapy for myeloma isn't curative. To date, hasn't been curative for most patients, and most patients have a superb quality of life for a year, but it relapses very quickly at that point. And again, I think when companies are looking at contracting, at the moment, the lymphoma ones you're contracting for cure. For myeloma, you're probably contracting for a year. Quality of life benefit, not a curative, and I guess that will become important when you're discussing costs and amounts. So that indication will come. It's going to be a lot of patients. We do about 60 transplants a year for myeloma patients. So that's going to be 60 CAR T therapies, likely if it hits the mainstream. Then Prof. O'Dwyer in Galway is developing an NK cell program, and who knows what that's in early stages. But again, who knows what that's going to break through. So we budgeted for 15 to 20 people for next year, for CAR T, and hopefully we'll get there. But honestly, for the year after that, we expect that to double, and for the year after that to maybe exponentially increase as new indications for these therapies come. And as long as they hold their real world evidence that at 40% are actually cured from what was an incurable disease before these therapies. They're also talking about using these therapies up earlier. So now, instead of having an auto transplant, which in total we do 90 of a year, there's a trial for lymphomas going on now where you have an auto or a CAR T therapy. If the CAR T proves beneficial, which I think it probably will, it's going to be very hard to tell somebody you can have an autograft when you could have a CAR T therapy. That's as Jill said, is maybe your only line of treatment that you're going to need, and you'll be cured. It looks like, Jill didn't comment on it, but it looks like if you survive the first 6 months, it looks like you have you're going to make it, and that's what it looks like in the real world data for now. I think, Jill, you'll probably agree with that. Certainly, if you get to 9 months, the line flattens off very quickly. There's still people who die very quickly after CAR T, and they're the people with the more aggressive diseases. Like, we could make the data look really good by just doing a CAR T on those people that we know will do well.
Yeah.
But that's a bit like the surgeon picking the easy operations and having 100% success rate. That's probably not the right way to do it either. But it's tempting to do it that way at that high cost. I mean, if somebody came to me from a fiscal center and said, why did you spend €1 million on that guy when you knew he probably wouldn't survive? I mean, the answer is because he probably might have survived, and when somebody survives, €1 million is not a lot of money. It's a lot of money, otherwise. But that's why we keep doing it. That's why we keep pushing for it. And just to go back to data very quickly, we are as part of our program we have to, or at least it's expected that we will submit all of our data to the European Bone Marrow Transplant Registry. And that's part of our consent process. At the moment, just to add the complexity, to have a CAR T, you have to sign 4 consent forms at the moment, but one of those is for the EBMT data registry with all the GDPR attachments onto it. So yeah, it's an exciting time. It looks like a curative option, but for and it's going to increase for sure. Which will I don't know, may bring down the cost of production, but it may not hugely help with the cost in hospital costs. There are some moves in the States to move these to outpatient protocols, and they've started to do that. But the caveat to that is that while they advertise we're doing this as an outpatient, they have a hotel across the road where the patient stays, and the nurse comes and visits them in the evening time. So it's a different type of outpatients than having to go down to Slattery or Mines to find your patient in the evening time after they've been discharged. So it's tempting to look at outpatients and say, oh, it's all great, but that's a very specific type of outpatients that the US are doing.
Yeah, and I think, as you say, Larry, and it's it's not the patient can go home and not have any not need of any follow-up care or whatever it is. It's a very different type of arrangement. Jill, maybe just back to yourself for a moment on that, in terms of that European collection of data and data being made available at European level. You mentioned obviously the Nordics having very rich data sets. Do you think, are we as a European Union, are we moving in the right direction in terms of getting? You touched on some of the developments there earlier. Are we moving fast enough in order to be able to get the data that's needed, or is there more work to be done?
That's a very tough question, because I had some really high expectation, and that's just my personal view on some of the IMI project. We are amazing, but it's quite slow. It's fantastic what's happening. I think even yesterday there was a data for me. I think there was a European meeting on real world evidence, and it's quite slow on that front. What we see a lot happening is some key hospitals like Karolinska Institute are linking with other hospitals in terms of their electronic medical record. And it's a group of hospitals where you can get access to very high level data, and everything is being put in one format, and you can access to the data, or you can ask the research question. You can get the so we are seeing a lot of this in Europe. China is growing at the moment for us in terms of the kind of the real world evidence. It's very strong. The best at the moment for us probably will be US and Nordics and the UK. I think UK is making some big effort on this, and as I say to you, is I'm still hopeful that things will happen in Ireland. There's a very strong registry. I mean, the cancer registry. There is also some of CF's registry. So there's a lot of data that we potentially could get access to, respect of the data privacy and everything. So I think that will be. But one thing that I see a lot, and what Larry was saying, is something what we're doing is through bioinformatics. We're trying to use real world evidence at a very early stage of the research, maybe to identify very early the responders. And that's something what we're trying to do. And that's linking bioinformatics and real world evidence. And that's a really growing area. And the beauty is Ireland has a very good, through the University of Trinity, UCD, and Maynooth, a very strong bioinformatics program. So that's something we're trying to partner with them at the global level. So I'll finish on the thing where I have a lot of people who have joined my team recently from academia, and the feedback is we're getting really excited about insurance claim electronic medical record. But a lot of people say we've done that for 30 years in academia. Pharma is just waking up to this, but it's needed for because of the exciting journey that it's taking place.
Yep. No, thanks, Jill. And we're coming up to time. I think we have just time maybe for one or two last questions. And thanks to everyone who submitted questions. I probably haven't been able to get to them all, but really, really interesting questions coming through. Alice, maybe a last question for you before we wrap up. I suppose you've talked about sort of the different contracting approaches, and Gilles and Larry have talked about some of the developments they see across Europe as well, and no doubt you're seeing that as well. To pick up on the point that Larry made earlier about the impact of COVID, do you see any impact yet in terms of the way health systems are contracting? Maybe it's too soon, but I'm not sure if you're seeing any developments in that space in terms of maybe things slowing down or things changing in the way that they were progressing.
So I think that's a very good question. I mean, from our side, those type of discussion across markets have not slowed down. So I think it's even a bigger topic than before. There's a lot of payer system actually realized that during COVID, for example, if you think about oncology, because there's so many innovative products there's been a lot of change in terms of the patient pathway and the treatment pathway, with a lot of cancer patient having to receive treatment at home. So I think actually we hear a lot of providers and our pharma clients saying that they realize that actually a value of a medicine could be just beyond the clinical value of it, and therefore they're more and more keen to understand other benefits that different medicines bring. So there's definitely a move more towards value-based healthcare in general, and therefore also on contracting as well. Obviously, things have slowed down in terms of conversation in general, because it's not kind of top priority of payers at the moment. But they definitely realize that they need to focus more on those kind of other benefits that medicines are bringing, and not just the clinical value. I think the other interesting thing from COVID, and obviously there's so much going on in our industry, is the acceleration of adoption of technology. So we have a lot of our clients that saying, in the past, it would take us maybe 20 months to have a discussion about new technology to bring to NHS England. Now in COVID, it took 3 months, it took 6 months to bring some of those technology to market, because of the urgency and the pressure on those systems to manage this pandemic. There's been such a huge adoption of new technology, and payers all across Europe are talking about they need new digital solutions. So even though it has been very costly for healthcare systems, actually I think there's a real push towards digital solution and new technology. I think the other very interesting point is around data linkage. So as we said during this presentation today, sometimes you have data, but for example, you may have a patient that will be admitted to a specific hospital. They may receive their treatment later on in a community center or center closer to their home. They may move, right? They move places. They go to a different hospital in a different region or a different country. So sometimes it's very hard when you do outcome-based contracting to really follow that patient and get the data for that patient across. And that's because, hospital may have good data, but they're not necessarily, the data linkage is not necessarily very good. There's no data integration at the national system. And during COVID, they realized that. So when we speak, for example, to oncology centers, they realized that was such a big gap, and that was really a burden on them, on making sure they could understand, the patient pathway, the patient journey, and get, data as quickly as possible in real time from other hospital where that patient may have been admitted as well. So we see a lot more of projects in different systems around, making sure there's more data integration at a national level, and there's more real-time sharing of the data as well. So I really think that COVID has pushed kind of, payer system to realize also that actually, technology is they can adopt technology much quicker than they thought they could.
Yep, thank you very much, Alice. I think we have probably just about 5 minutes left in our questions, and thanks to Roisin for that last question. There are a few that unfortunately we won't get to. Maybe just to wrap up with our panel session here, what might be useful is, maybe if I go around to each of you, Larry, I'll start with you again. In terms of, if there was 2 or 3, I suppose, key messages that you thought would be good to share with the group this morning, maybe to sum up, I'd be delighted to hear what you think the key opportunities and developments might be.
Yeah, I think to stay on the contracting base, I think this and we've seen it in evolution, is this outcome-based contracting, and I think that it makes, to me as a physician, makes perfect sense as a way to move ahead. I understand the HSE and stuff may have some difficulties with that, as Alice pointed to, with not having the technology there, to be sure. I would hope that the outcome and retrieving the data should be fairly straightforward in a small country like this. People do move, but as it stands, St. James's will be the national and only centre. That's unlikely to continue. I mean, the rationale for that was not that we're all so brilliant, but it was just that we did have the allogeneic centre, and a lot of the side effects and are very similar, and we have, I suppose, the staff to deal with that, and that was the rationale for that. So in the short term, certainly outcome data should be relatively easy to follow up. I think to pick up on Jill saying that we need data. Often, what the data that I get asked for from a company is data that we just don't have and don't collect. So I can certainly tell you if you're alive or dead, but don't ask me what medications he was on the 4th of January and did they change on the 5th. And I know that's the data that the companies really like, but we have moved to an electronic-based system in James's now for everything as an inpatient, so that might help a little, Jill, going forward. I think people should take away from this that although, and I know I've spoken a lot to cost, although I talk about cost of this and it is expensive, I think it's a very worthwhile therapy, certainly the CAR T therapy. The gene therapies, our National Coagulation Centre here and our colleagues in haematology there have some experience with the factor 9 gene, and they've got two patients now in clinical trial with that, and they've had phenomenal success with that. So I mean, they have literally changed people's lives of being, running factor 9 levels of less than 1%, and they're now running up at 48-50%, which is a completely hemostatic level. So that will change their lives forever, that they're not injecting concentrate every couple of days or with the newer ones every couple of weeks. So those therapies are coming too. They're expensive on trial and pharma trial. At least they haven't. It actually brings some income into the hospital to do those sort of trials. And I think it's important from the CAR T perspective. It's very hard to convince somebody that we can do a clinical trial in CAR T when we haven't done a commercial product. But we do have a huge clinical cancer department here, and we'll be keen to start to do them once we get up and running as well. What else? I think that's probably it. I mean, from a physician's perspective, it's good to know, and I think in fairness, we've been kept up to date a lot with CAR T there, but that these negotiations are ongoing, and attempts are made to somewhat reduce the burden and to try and help get these technologies. I hate to not call them a drug, and I don't want to upset all the pharmacists in the audience, but they really are, I suppose, the living drug is the newer term for them, to get these living drugs through. Okay, so thanks.
Thank you, Larry. Thanks very much for your contribution. Gilles, I think we have maybe about 30 seconds, maybe if there was 2 or 3 key messages from you.
The key messages for me is what's going to resonate for me is that's why we all here is what Larry was saying about your patient that is 52 in the Midlands, and that person now is able to have a good quality of life. I've seen direct, impact for some of our SMA campaign for young kids. We're entering an amazing journey, and it's all work together to find solution for this patient to get and the right patient to get access to the medicine. So that's really my last comment.
Thank you very much. And Alice, I think just in the interest of time, I know you've had a chance maybe to share some of your ideas at the start, so we might give you a pass on this one if that's okay. I think, look, at all that remains for me to do is to say thanks to Alice, to Larry, and to Gilles for your contribution. That was really interesting. Thanks to the audience for all the really interesting questions. I think it was a very, very useful discussion. I've certainly learned a lot, and I hope others have as well. Thanks to Oliver and to Aoife for allowing us the opportunity to facilitate the session this morning. We really enjoyed it, and I think at that, Oliver, passing back over to you to close and wrap up the session.
Thank you very much, Gary, and thank you indeed to Alice, to Gilles, to Larry for a really insightful discussion there. And what I took particularly from all that discussion was, first of all, yes, there are immense and indeed real challenges that we have to understand, or how the payer or the public sector side look at this and meet their concerns. We have to understand the detail of the patient, the care pathway, let's say, the entire complexity of it. And indeed, pharma companies in this space will be much more partners in that care pathway than simply providers of a consumable input into it. And Gilles is giving us always good reasons for hope and optimism. So, and I would just like to end on that note, because a good while ago in Ireland, there seemed to be areas of public expenditure and capital investment which were difficult, and we didn't have the capacity to do that. And now the public sector has become an awful lot more comfortable, indeed highly skilled at contracting arrangements in the areas of public capital investments through using the NDFA, in particular in areas of roads, schools, hospitals, indeed, and there's a wide range of contracting solutions that they've become quite expert at, which of course rely on good data, but also rely on some good applied thinking to solve problems in those areas. So, while it might seem presently difficult, and there are a lot of challenges, the idea is that when the case is there, the capacity of the public sector usually does respond. But we do have to be not just patient waiting for it to respond, but to help the public sector, our public sector friends and counterparts, to actually, apply new solutions, new innovative thinking to these types of contracts, and to solve real problems that are there. But they can be solved, and indeed they will be solved, because these technologies are so attractive and are so valuable indeed for patients and for the whole societies. So with that, I would say thank you again to EY. We'll have a lot more to say about cell and gene therapies in the coming months and years. And we look forward to the next Digital Thinking series. Thank you very much indeed, and good morning.